This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Kicking things off, a question for you from Emily in Tennessee, who says, I just watched the episode on body picking. I would love to hear more about the SNAP method that Rachel was saying she used for her trichotillomania and the shock bracelet. Any other handy tips or tricks?
Yeah, thanks for this question. And first, I'm sorry if you're struggling with this. I'm happy to share more about my experience with it. So, this harks back to episode 22, which covered this group of disorders called body-focused repetitive behaviors, which you may recall resemble sort of self-grooming behaviors in animals, and which are a combination of a pleasurable feeling for many people, along with the anxiety-reducing compulsions in OCD. As Emily noted in her question, in that episode, I mentioned my own struggles with trichotillomania, which is a version of the disorder involving compulsive hair pulling. So it could be from the scalp, eyebrows, eyelashes, or body areas. My particular challenge is with eyelashes. And some of the methods that helped me manage it included this shock bracelet from a company called Pavlok, which is a fun pun of a name. It helps break various intrusive repetitive behaviors, can be helpful in fighting compulsive behaviors like hair pulling, nail biting, skin picking. What's both cool and challenging is that it can be set up to require mostly self-monitoring, where you're inducing the shocks or vibrations yourself in response to the behavior. And at the beginning, you want to explicitly couple them to condition the association, carry out the problematic behavior repeatedly, following each with a shock. Early on, while I was still getting used to the bracelet, I found it helpful to combine the bracelet with some external monitoring support via the SNAP method that I mentioned in that earlier episode, where I asked family and some close friends to just snap their fingers anytime they saw me touching my eyelashes. I did also see a number of online suggestions about putting Vaseline on the lashes to make the behavior itself feel more aversive and less satisfying. Personally, I didn't find this to be very effective, but many people seem to have had success with that as well, so certainly worth trying. But yeah, these Pavlok bracelets have served me well. I would add that they're designed for all sorts of other behavioral conditioning goals. So they can be used as an alarm, can be set to limit screen time, reinforce workout routines. So potentially very useful for a lot of people.
Quick question that I suspect others might be wondering as well. Does the shock hurt? How intense is it?
Well, the shock intensities are gradated, so you can choose from the range and vary it according to need. You can also just have it vibrate without the shock. So the pain can be very minimal. I'd actually describe it more as just jarring than painful. It gets your attention. Again, a nice feature of the whole system is that it can be self-regulated, so you determine what shock level you want to apply, the duration, etc. So there's a solid sense of control and predictability, something I once heard a wise man say is good to minimize stress. We've obviously discussed how strong this sense of control can be. I mean, this reminds me of the studies you've talked about concerning people with major incapacitating pain, where half their lives were spent counting the minutes until a health professional gave them more pain meds. And someone made the crazy suggestion to allow people to self-medicate themselves with the painkillers. And of course, the expectation was that this would be a disaster. People would become addicted, would overdose. Instead, what was seen was that people actually used less painkillers when they were self-medicating. People need the meds not just to control the pain of their disease, but to control the pain of the uncertainty. Did the nurse hear that I buzzed? Are they busy? How long will I have to wait for some pain relief? So, related concepts.
Yep, exactly. Control and predictability are hugely important.
Okay, so now two thematically similar questions. First, Mariana from Brazil asks, have you ever faced any criticism or backlash for being an atheist? And are atheists indeed less hopeful, happy, or trustworthy than their religious counterparts? And then Tamam from Syria says, I'm deeply passionate about evolutionary theory, but even discussing it is considered a crime in my country. What should I do?
Well, we tap into two domains in which our infinitely tolerant, pluralistic world does not have a great record. Oh, being an atheist, believing and teaching evolution. Hell, just to round it out to the big three, being gay, engaging in gay sex. Starting off, atheism. Currently, there are 13 countries on Earth where you can get the death penalty for being an atheist. And that includes mostly Middle Eastern Muslim majority countries, ones that do not seem enormously appealing, Afghanistan, Mauritania, so on. Interestingly, there's only 7 countries currently where they will kill you if you are found to have engaged in gay sex. Those 7 are all subsets of the 13 that are down on atheists. The one exception being Uganda. Uganda, you could be an atheist all you want and just don't get caught having gay sex because they'll kill you. So, interesting thing, which is among those 13 countries where you get the death penalty for being an atheist, they also note that you can't hold public office if you were an atheist, which seems a little bit puzzling, as if they would have said, well, you can be elected to office, but then we'll kill you. Meanwhile, on other fronts, international fronts, the Nazis were not big fans of atheism, mainly because they associated it with those godless communists. And historically, the Nazis are viewed as having been rather down on the church. That has only been to the extent that the church said they may not have been great people, to the extent that the German church hierarchy got in line to support the Third Reich. They were just fine. Himmler, for example, if you applied to be an SS stormtrooper and you didn't believe in God, forget about it. You could not get into the club. As Himmler said, we believe in Almighty God who gave us the Führer. Now, interestingly, Hitler himself never said it out loud, but in his sort of private conversations and journals, he made it clear that he believed that God had selected him to run Germany. And in that regard, my bet is he is similar to most American presidents who probably kind of kept it to themselves, their thought that God had selected them. We have 2 recent presidents, though, who have said out loud that they believe that God had selected them to lead our land. The first one being George W. Bush, and the second, our current president of the United States. Okay, so shifting over to atheism in the United States. Currently, there are no places in the US where they will put you to death for not believing in God, but in 7 states, at least on paper, in the statutes, you cannot hold public office if you are an atheist. You cannot serve on a jury if you are an atheist. And I'll give you a guess which part of the country all 7 of those states are in. The reality is it pretty much is never enforced, but nonetheless, it is still on the books there. There are documented cases throughout the United States in family courts where family court judges have denied somebody during a divorce case custody of their children because of the incredibly dangerous, infectious state that the parent was in of being an atheist. Likewise, polls show by a wide margin, people think that if there are 2 individuals who are equally in need of a kidney transplant, and one is a Christian and the other is an atheist, without question, the Christian should get the kidney. Now, we see some long-standing, pretty downward looking opinions about them atheists when asking Americans who they would vote for. And of course, the question becomes, would you vote for president, someone who was and now we round up all the usual suspects, an atheist, a communist, a Muslim, Jew, Hispanic, Catholic, gay? What you see is, among all those categories, the one that generates the most animosity, the most people are willing to say, I would not vote for a person like that, is atheists. In the polls, only 50% of Americans say they'd be willing to vote for an atheist running for president. And then coming in just a whisker behind in second place, 58% of Americans say they'd be willing to vote for somebody Muslim, 65% somebody gay, and then for the rest, it is just heartwarming openness out the wazoo. Over 90% of Americans say they would vote for someone who is Black, a woman, Jewish, Catholic, Hispanic. So things are sailing smooth from there. Okay, so some definite opinions about that. One other interesting finding, 44% of Americans say they would be distinctly unhappy if their child married an atheist. And I got news for you, you theists. I know plenty of atheists who would be pretty upset if their kid married a deeply religious person. So touche, right back at you. When you consider that, what that's suggesting is that there's a sort of mating going on between believers and between atheists. And thus what we're gradually seeing is speciation. Soon we will have two different species of humans, those who do and do not believe in deities. Now, all of this comes down to the question of, so what's the deal with atheists? Can you trust them? First off, are they happy? Are they hopeful? And what the studies tend to show is higher rates of clinical depression among atheists. And in my view, Doug, go figure. What religious belief is about is giving comforting answers to questions that have no answers. And one of my favorite definitions of depression is a pathological inability to rationalize away reality. And what atheists do is they have trouble rationalizing away reality. So you see higher rates of depression there. But the more fundamental question is, can you trust them atheists being in charge of anything? Because they're going to be totally immoral because they don't believe there is a God or gods who are going to punish them if they do something wrong. This is the driving force behind the opinion held by the majority of Americans that atheists are less trustworthy, less honest than are theistic individuals, simply because you don't have the carrot and stick working there. There's no belief in someone or other who is going to punish you if you do bad things. Now, the usual response of atheists to that is, oh yeah, how great is it if you're only being nice to your fellow humans because somebody's going to throw a lightning bolt at you? Nonetheless, the common perception, majority of Americans believe that on the average, atheists are less honest and less trustworthy than are highly religious people. What do the studies actually show? Something very different. You get people who are highly, highly reflectively religious, or people who are highly reflectively atheistic in their beliefs. And what you see is in study after study, precisely the same high levels of ethical, moral behavior in all sorts of testing circumstances. Who winds up in between? The people who, yeah, they believe in God. It's not like I think about it often. We go to the big holidays. I make sure the kids learn something about it. It's not a big deal. Or the people who don't believe in God, who say, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in the Easter Bunny. Like apatheist. It's not a big deal. It's not like I think about it very often. If the question of whether or not there is a God isn't something that is particularly of interest to you, you have lower rates of moral behavior than do people who are highly religious or highly atheistic in their beliefs. What's that about? In both cases, you have thought long and hard about, why are we here? And what is the source of human goodness? And if you've thought long and hard about these tough things, it almost doesn't matter which camp you wind up in. You are going to be on the average more scrupulous, more honest, more trustworthy in your actions. So, coming back to the question about me, though, I've been an atheist since I was 14, and there's only been one circumstance in my life where I hesitated to tell somebody I was an atheist, and this was my parents, who went to their graves having no idea that I no longer believed in God. But have I ever paid any sort of price for it? No, absolutely not. I'm in this eggheady, privileged intelligentsia existence. I've never lived more than 2 miles from either the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. I'm surrounded by secular humanists, sufficiently so that if you encounter somebody in my world who, in passing, says something like, oh, no, we can't do that on Sunday. We go to church Sunday mornings. The normal response is, oh, whoa, you're religious. That's interesting. How's that been? In other words, I've paid no price for that at all. So now we transition to the second question, another domain of being a pariah, and to Mom's question about evolution. I want to learn about evolution. How do I go about doing it? Because I am in Syria where you are not allowed to learn about evolution. You are not allowed to teach it. So we get the third of our great festering marks of Cain on you, being an atheist, being gay, believing in evolution and wanting to teach about it. There's no countries on earth where they will kill you for believing in evolution, but there's a whole lot of countries where the teaching of it is banned. In the United States, that is the case in some of our outposts of the nation. What is more often by now done is the great creationist infiltration of thinking about biology, which is, yeah, it's okay to teach kids about evolution as long as you tell them it's only a theory. Don't get me started on that one. And here are some equally credible counter interpretations about how the world works that are heavily, heavily dependent on a belief in Tinkerbell. You got to give unscientific, countervailing views. Amid that, America is not particularly convinced about evolution. 50% of Americans believe you cannot believe in God and believe in evolution. They are incompatible. And I kind of fall in that camp in some ways, but for very different reasons than most of those folks. What you see is only about 40% of Americans, people who are, oh, I don't know, allowed to vote or operate a motor vehicle or things like that. Only about 40% of Americans say that there is convincing scientific evidence that evolution is for real. And that puts the United States, I think, at the bottom of the list of westernized, industrialized countries, percentage of people who accept that there's evolution. Okay, so now getting back to the situation that you're in, Tamam, which is you were in Syria. Since the revolution last year, education has gotten a lot less secular, and the teaching of evolution there is now officially blocked in your country. And two questions come to mind. First off, how are you supposed to learn about evolution? Well, you've just proven a good way to do it. If you have access to something like this podcast thingy, go online, learn about the subject, go to Khan Academy, get basic introductions to evolutionary theory, go look at all sorts of lectures, more advanced topics on it, a gazillion wonderful natural history documentaries out there that explore the reality of evolution. The second question is, so how are you supposed to navigate living in your society where you're not allowed to say, this is really interesting stuff? Do you happen to believe the same thing I do, where there is a veil of silence about it? And I don't suggest you go out and get yourself into trouble by saying, evolution is for real. Let me tell you why. Maybe a strategy is to use the puzzled, quizzical, vacant expression on your face as you sit down people who might be fellow travelers, might be sympathetic, and don't say anything argumentative or anything that is meant to be convincing. Just bring up puzzling stuff. You know what's really puzzling to me? You know what's really puzzling? Whales. Whales have leg bones, and snakes have pelvic bones, and humans have vestigial tailbones. What's that about? What a weird thing. I just discovered that recently. What do you suppose explains why whales might have vestigial leg bones? Or bring up something else. Whoa, I discovered something really interesting yesterday. There's more than 100 species of lemurs, and they all live in Madagascar. And what that means is when Noah landed his ark on Mount Ararat in northern Turkey, and all the animals came out, all 200 lemurs, the 100 species of their pairs, all 200 lemurs at that point all walked about 1,500 miles from Turkey to Iran to the southern tip of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, swam about 100 miles to Somalia, walked another 100 miles or so, swam 1,500 miles to Madagascar, and all of them made it there, and not a single one of them died along the way and left a skeleton. No one has ever found an ancestral lemur skeleton outside of Madagascar. Wow, isn't that, what do you suppose, what happened when they got off the ark and all 200 of them decided to go to Madagascar? I don't know. I've been wondering about that recently. Or I read humans, they can sequence your DNA, and we have our genomic sequences. They're 98.5% shared with like chimps and bonobos. And then you get to species that just strike me as being further from humans, and there's less shared genes, like 92% by the time you're looking at a baboon, or 80% when you're looking at a mouse, or 60% when you're looking at a fish, or 13% when you're looking at some crabgrass or something. How weird is that? Don't those strike you as kind of weird? I wonder what that's about. I've just been wondering recently. And with any luck, if you do it that way, you will find out some other people are wondering about it too. Or better yet, you will get people to start wondering about it. So good luck with that process, and good luck doing something brave in a far less tolerant setting than I have the luxury of living in.
Wrapping up, Matvey from California asks, is there such a thing as pathological or clinical happiness as a condition, as opposed to depression and feeling sadness? Can humans be incapacitated by happiness, cheerfulness, and excitement?
I suspect they certainly can be incapacitated by happiness, and that's probably better defined as stopping you in your tracks, jaw-dropping awe at something transcendent about the world. But much more focused here, is there anything resembling a psychiatric disorder of people who are not able to function normally because they are too happy, or they are too cheerful, or they are too excited? Now, I'm going to avoid going down some philosophical rabbit hole of discussing whether we could actually be happy all the time, because is happiness only happiness if it's mixed with the negative and the contrast, and we need the bitter with the sweet? And I'm going to ignore that entirely and instead focus on happiness, cheerfulness, excitement. Excitement is interesting because is it possible to be pathologically excitable? And I think what this begins to tap into is the difference between us liking something, us wanting something, and us needing something. Needing is overwhelmingly about addiction. You don't like it, you don't want it, you know it's ruining your life, but you need it, you need it, you need it to the point that it's ripping, shredding your cells, withdrawal from it. Wanting, on the other hand, is about future-oriented excitement. Liking, ooh, I like this. This is present tense. Wanting is future-oriented. It's about excitement. It's about motivation. And what you see is there is a disease where you have pathologically high levels of excitement and motivation, so strong that it could overcome reason, that it could overcome fatigue. What are we talking about? This is the mania of bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder, depressive components, manic components. The manic involves extraordinarily high levels of energy, minimal need for sleep, for food, rushing of thoughts, rushing of words, rushing of grandiosity coming in there, sometimes to the extent of being delusional, and in some ways most defining, tremendous degrees of excitement. Excitement about what you are figuring out, supposedly, about how the world works. Now, what do we know about the workings of bipolar disorder? There's one whole story built around abnormalities in circadian clocks inside the brain, and that begins to explain how people in a manic state can just phase shift and go on 2 hours of sleep a night for weeks on end. That's one whole piece of the story. The other piece is that people with mania are hyper responsive to reward and anticipation. That could take a number of forms. You are being pulled towards something, but you're also anxious about it because there's some scary aspects to it. You're vacillatory, there's avoidance, there's ambiguity, there's push pull. In the mania of bipolar disorder, the excitement, the drive, the appetite overrides the avoidance, the anxiety. So you do stuff you would normally be scared of. Second thing you see is people in manic phases overgeneralize reward. What do I mean by this? You are in a manic episode, you go into a Starbucks one morning and you get your coffee, and they say, as they're handing it to you by the cash register, today is your lucky day. We've got this random number generator here by the cash register, and it just came up. Your number wins you a free coffee cake. We're having a giveaway today. You just got a free coffee cake. And the logical overgeneralizing of reward thing to do at that point is say, I'm going to get in my car now and drive 15 straight hours to Las Vegas and use my life savings, because if I'm getting a free coffee cake, I'm obviously going to just make a bundle. Or suppose you walk into a store and you hear 4 seconds of some, I don't know, Gregorian chant music on ukuleles or something, and in your manic face you say, oh my God, that's amazing. And you track someone down and says, do you know who did that music? And they tell you some group you've never heard of. And within an hour, you are at your computer tracking that group, seeing they are in a world tour. They're going to be here this month. They're going to be in this country. And you have now spent your life savings buying tickets to their concerts in a dozen different countries, getting plane reservations, getting hotel reservations. This is the overgeneralizing of pleasure, of reward. I liked that, hearing that music. So thus, obviously, I should now follow them around the planet. The third component to this over responsiveness to reward is you don't habituate. If you have bipolar disorder, if you are in that manic phase, and if that person managed to take out enough usurious, destructive loans to be able to actually go to all 27 of those concerts around the planet, at the end of it, they would still be just as excited as they were after hearing the music for the first time. You don't get habituation. So these characteristics of being hyper responsive to reward is you are excited enough about what you anticipate to overcome adverse things that would make you avoidant. You overgeneralize reward from one category to another, and you don't habituate. And it turns out what we know about the neurobiology of mania fits perfectly well with this. And this takes us naturally to dopamine. And what has been a repeating trope for us, people used to think dopamine is about reward and pleasure. And then people learned dopamine is about anticipation of pleasure, even more so. And then they learned even more so than that, it is about the goal-directed behavior, the motivation you feel in order to try to get that pleasure that you were anticipating. Dopamine is mostly about driving you appetitively towards getting something that you are wanting. And thus, what you see is there's problems in the dopamine system in exactly this domain in people with mania. You see, for example, the core part of the brain where you make the dopamine that's most pertinent to all of this stuff is something called the ventral tegmental area. We've talked about it before. It sends a dopamine releasing projection to a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which proceeds to then project all over the limbic emotional system and project up to the frontal cortex in an interesting way, projecting to this little sub area of the prefrontal cortex that we've mentioned in the past called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. This is how your emotional part of your brain, your limbic system, your dopamine system with a vengeance, tells your eggheady prefrontal cortex making nice rational decisions about amazing emotional news and trying to persuade it to do something that it otherwise would be hesitant to do. This is exactly where you get overcoming ambivalence and vacillation and push-pull about stuff that evokes anxiety and avoidance. This is the dopamine ventral tegmental branch by way of this ventral medial prefrontal cortex convincing your prefrontal cortex as a whole, go for it, go for it. It doesn't matter if it's scary or not. You want it. You want it. Go for it. Go for it. And exactly as you would expect in mania and bipolar disorder, you see the ventral tegmental area is enlarged and there's greater connectiveness between it and that ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Another piece of the story, post-mortem studies of people with bipolar disorder, and what you see are elevated levels of dopamine receptors in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Dopamine receptors, particularly the D2 receptor, which is very responsive to dopamine. This is not only the ventral tegmental area going in overdrive in sending, I want, I'm excited messages to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is enhanced in its sensitivity to it. Some more hints that there's a dopamine excess over the top problem. In mania, a number of drugs which block dopamine receptors help to control some aspects of mania. And some people hearing this might recognize, ooh, dopamine receptor blockers, they are used primarily in another branch of psychiatry for treatment of schizophrenia, the delusional thoughts, the disordered thoughts. Dopamine receptor blockers are the first line there. And what that tells you is clinically, there's some similarities between the delusions of schizophrenia and the driven, grandiose, excitable delusions that you can see in bipolar disorder. Finally, some of the genetic clues about bipolar include a gene coding for a protein called anchorin. And what does anchorin do? Anchorin anchors dopamine receptors to the membrane of the neurons that they're in, somehow facilitating the dopamine system. So it's got a dopamine excess flavor written all over it. This is a disease of hyper excitation in response to reward or the possibility of reward. Now, this may strike some of you as kind of interesting that getting so excited about reward sounds a little bit like teenagers. And you can see a beautiful demonstration of this. You take an adult and you put them in a brain scanner and you put them in a circumstance where they are expecting a reward of this size. And when they get the reward, they have a little bit of a boost of dopamine. And then unexpectedly now and then, you give them a bigger than expected reward and they have a bigger boost of dopamine. You put a teenager in there and they get the expected reward and you get the same rise as in the adult, but you give them a bigger than expected reward and they go through the roof, much more responsive than the adult dopamine system would be, hyper responsive to unexpected reward. This is what the teenage brain is about. This may tell us something about why significantly higher risk of one having one's first manic episodes late adolescence to early adulthood. So, getting back to our starting point, we're looking at pathology. We're looking at a bad thing. This sounds great. This sounds wonderful. You were so excited. You're so excited about your grandiose ideas. I've just figured out something that will not only cure global warming, but be a device for fixing fitted sheets so they don't make you desperate when you can't put them on by yourself. Whoa, what an amazing, exciting thing I've thought of. All I need to do is build it now. What a great thing to be that excited about life. What this begins to tap into is one of the great clinical challenges of treating people with bipolar disorder when they are effectively medicated, most often with lithium, drugs that are called mood stabilizers, and in some cases, these dopamine receptor blockers. When people are cured of their mania, they miss it because the world is monochromatic now, and the pull to say, screw it, I want to be on this incredible high again, people stop taking their meds. So what's wrong with that? It sounds great. It sounds great, except it's a phenomenally destructive disease that wipes out people's life savings, their health, their relationships, damage those around them. That's one big problem. Another big problem with it is a source of profound negativity when all that anticipatory excitement turns out not to work out. When it turns out you go to Las Vegas and just because you got the free coffee cake this morning doesn't mean things are going to go great. When people in a manic state are disappointed, they become very irritable, very belligerent, very destroyed, often thrown down into a depressive state. The single best evidence that this is not some great, wonderful, euphoric state of pathology to be in is that among all of the mood disorders, people with bipolar disorder have the highest rates of attempting suicide, 25 to 50%. That's a pretty high number. So this is not something that sounds so great. Ooh, imagine day after day being so excited by a rush of ideas that you don't even feel tired. This is a disaster of a disease. So I think this is the closest thing I can come up with of, in a sense, a psychiatric disease of pathological excitement and anticipation.
That's it for episode 105. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.